Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nita Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're talking about some more Bloomburrow today. Last week we looked at the 17 lands data and talked about 10 cards that were being taken too early based on how they're actually performing in the format. This week we're going to do the flip side of that. We're going to look at cards that are being undervalued, cards that should be being taken earlier based on how they're performing in the format. So for this video, I'll be using 17 lands data. You can go to 17lands.com and sign up for them to track your data on Magic Arena. Lots and lots of people are doing that, and that's why we have all this data that we can look at and analyze when discussing a format. As usual, I like to use a sort of baseline card at the beginning of each of these videos because they kind of introduce us to the metrics that I'll be using, what they mean, and they also serve as a pretty good jumping off point for the cards we're going to look at. This time I wanted to look at Sticky Tongue Sentinel. This is a nice common. I think we can all agree about that. 3 mana, 3/3 reach. And then it has some real upside with this bounce effect, and it isn't even upside that's restricted to the Frog deck. Like, it's especially good with Hunter's Talent. That's sort of the most broken thing you can do. But returning a Carrot Cake or something like that is pretty nice value too. And this card is being taken right around a 7th pick on average, and it has a win rate of 55.8%. And when I say win rate, I want to explain that I'm using game in hand win rate on 17 lands. That is a metric that looks at any time this card ends up in someone's hand, how often are they winning, whether it's in their opening hand or whether it's a card they draw later. There are other metrics on 17 lands that one can use. In fact, there's lots of them. And in an ideal world, like, we'd go on a super deep dive and look at all the data for every card. But at some point, it really becomes inscrutable because there's so much. And I like just using one metric. And I think the one metric that does the best job of showing us, all the upsides and downsides of a card is game in hand win rate. Metrics like improvement when drawn really only count when you draw the card after it's in your opening hand and things like that. So that's why I like to use this specific metric. And also, important to remember that 17 lands users have a higher than normal win rate. The win rate on 17 lands is 54.7%. So Sticky Tongue Sentinel is 1.1% better than that average win rate, which is a nice common. It's not a great card, but, it's a common you end up playing 2 of in a lot of green decks, and you feel good about it. So, with this jumping off point in mind, the thing to remember is that every single card I'm going to look at in this video has either a higher win rate or about as high of a win rate, and is being taken later than Sticky Tongue Sentinel. This card that I think we can all agree is a pretty nice common. Every card on this list is performing better in terms of game in hand win rate, but being taken later. So let's go ahead and dive into the list. One I want to start with is Ravine Raider, and this is one I want to start with because I've heard other people who comment on Limited really be down on this card, and that surprises me, and I think the data backs up that this card certainly isn't bad. It has a 55.7% win rate, so it's a little worse than Sticky Tongue Sentinel, but it's being taken around pick 9.2. So, yeah, you can see that that's a massive difference, and it's only slightly worse than Sticky Tongue Sentinel. There are a few things going on here. Data is never perfect. You should never just use data to decide where you're going to pick cards. In this video, we're going to be discussing why it is these cards have the win rates they do, and not just saying these have good win rates because they are better, period, because there's more to it than that. And part of the reason the Sentinel's being taken so highly is people really want to be in green. Like, green overall is a pretty strong color. Black is not one of the sort of lower rung colors, blue and red being those, but it is significantly worse than green or white, which are the 2 best colors. So, people are going to be less interested in taking a card that's about as good as Sticky Tongue Sentinel, as highly as they take the Sentinel, because people want to be in green a little bit more, especially in the early stage of the draft. But I think the Raider is a pretty nice card, and I think it can kind of show you that black is being underrated to a degree. And we'll see a few other black cards on this list. This is just a really good one-drop. Like, if you play it on 1, it usually gets in for a few hits. And if you're in the black-red deck, things can get really crazy because you can set up all of these combat damage triggers like the Thought Picker Warlock and stuff like that so that you get extra value. And it really stays relevant all game long. If you're attacking with Ravine Raider, even in the late game, if your opponent isn't accounting for it, you can threaten to buff it. They have to put 2 bodies in front of it. It plays really well with Scales of Shale. Every lizard does, but a Menace lizard is going to have to be double blocked, right? So sometimes you can really blow them out with Scales of Shale. So, that's an important thing for a lizard, generally speaking. But I think it's an okay black 1-drop in any black deck in the format. It's certainly best in black-red because that's the most aggressive black deck in the format. Like, black-green's not super pumped about this card, for example. But it's okay in black-white and black-red, both decks that are reasonably aggressive overall. And yeah, I mean, it's a quality common that I feel good about playing like 2 of in both black-red and black-white. Again, just thinking about the fact that it compares really favorably with Sticky Tongue Sentinel, I think is a good indicator that this card is being underrated. So next I want to look at Light Shell Duo. So it's got a win rate of 55.1%, so it is substantially worse than the Sentinel. But it's also being taken around pick 10. So blue, like I was just saying, is one of the weaker colors in this format, but that doesn't mean you should never draft it. Like, the only color pair I would say that you should steer clear of, unless there's a situation where you end up with lots of really good uncommons, rares and mythics, which you can't really count on in limited, is blue-red. And that is what this is one of the signposts for. But it's okay in any blue deck. Blue-black, blue-green, these are decks that can play the duo. The Enter the Battlefield ability is, even if you're not interested in the graveyard at all, Surveil 2 is a pretty good way to set up better draws. And a 3/4 Prowess is a creature that, if you have mana up and cards in hand, it's actually pretty difficult for your opponent to block. Light Shell Duo is not great, but it is one of the better blue commons. It is a card that you should think about playing in your decks. I mean, if you're playing blue, you're probably playing it, because blue is pretty shallow when it comes to commons, and compared to other blue commons, it's really good. So, the duo should be getting taken a little bit higher. Maybe not a lot higher, because blue, it's sort of like what we talked about when we talked about Ravine Raider. It's in a color that you kind of hope you don't end up drafting, but if it's open, it's open, and the duo is a fine card when you end up in that situation. Let's look now at Lupin Flower Village. So I'm a pretty big fan of the villages, especially the white and black one. They're both going to be on this list, spoiler alert. But I want to talk about the white one first. So it's got a win rate of 56.7%, so that's a full 1.1% better than Sticky Tongue Sentinel, but it's being taken around pick 8.2. So, Lupin Flower Village is really nice. I mean, the most obvious reason that it works out so well is basically that it doesn't hurt your mana very much. It hurts it a little bit. Playing double colored removal spells and things gets harder if you've got a Lupin Flower Village. But it's worth the downside, because this is a land that in the late game you can crack and draw a card, basically. And it's not just any card. You end up drawing a creature, and usually by that stage you can just play the creature you hit right away. I have seen Lupin Flower Village whiff 0 times, and I've probably activated it myself, 30 times in the format. I've seen it activated probably a similar number of times. It's very hard to whiff with. This format just has so many creatures with the types that line up with Lupin Flower Village that if you're a predominantly white deck and you're going this many cards deep when you activate it, you have to be incredibly unlucky for it to not hit anything. So, it may not look like much. It's a land and it doesn't fix your mana, and that's usually the big thing people look for when they think about powerful lands in limited, or a land that has an ability that adds to the board, like makes creature tokens. It doesn't do those things, and you can really only activate it once, but having this land that taps for mana, does what all of your random planes do all game, and then having that land turn into a real card late, it's a big deal. And the win rate shows you that. This has the win rate of a very nice uncommon. It's a card you can take certainly earlier than pick 8, I think. I think I've picked up a Lupin Flower Village, pick 5 or 6 before, when it's pretty clear I'm going to be in white. My first several picks are all nice white cards. At that point, taking the village is a pretty good idea. It's just so good to have a land that actually does something. And since I already hinted at it, we'll also look at Mudflat Village now, which is doing even better, but it's also being taken a little sooner. And it's got a win rate of 57.6%. And it's taken around pick 7.7. So, same thing, more or less. It doesn't hurt your mana very much, and it has an ability that does the same thing, and I think, as the win rate will tell you, it's arguably even better. I mean, there are times where it isn't, but you're never going to whiff when you activate Mudflat Village, because you've got these creatures in your graveyard, and there are some gross creatures you can recur in this format too, Wix Patrol and things like that. Like, somebody brings that back with Mudflat Village, it's basically just game over. There are so many good creatures to recur, and even if you don't have one of those really nice ETB creatures that's basically a removal spell, you do still just get a real card out of your land in the late game. You know, getting back the squirrel that makes 2 food is also pretty gross. And getting any creature back at all feels pretty good because, you know, your land is doing it. Next, let's look at Dire Downdraft. So this removal spell, I said it in the last set. I can't remember what the name of this kind of removal spell was in the last set, but I said it then. I was like, this card always ends up, these blue removal spells always end up on these underrated lists. And there's a few reasons for it. One of them is the fact that blue should be, you should less enthusiastically get into blue in this limited format. But cards like Lightshell Duo, which we saw earlier, and Dire Downdraft, this card right here, I mean, these are the blue commons that can make your blue deck, solid. People just look at this kind of card and they think, well, this is just bad removal. You know, that's how they see a card like Dire Downdraft. But you know what? Dire Downdraft has a higher win rate than Banishing Light does in this limited format, which, you know, I think a lot of people would be surprised by that. But there are a few reasons for that. Well, first of all, Dire Downdraft's win rate of 56.1% is also more impressive than the win rate that Banishing Light has, which is 55.9%. That's Banishing Light, and we've got Dire Downdraft at 56.1. But the reason it's more impressive is that blue is weighed down by the quality of its commons a lot more than white is, where you've got, you know, a bunch of awesome commons just all over the place. So it's actually even more impressive than it is just based on the win rate. But Dire Downdraft is better, and there are, like I said, a few reasons for this. One of these is interaction at instant speed. Like, that's a big deal. Like, it's gotten pretty hard for Banishing Light-like cards to be, like, great anymore. You know, it's a solid removal spell now, but I think there's an argument that it's not even quite premium anymore, Banishing Light, that is. And that's because it's sorcery speed and it costs 3 mana. And those things in formats, especially faster ones, and this is one where things can get out of hand if you're not careful. So you end up killing creatures that cost the same or that are cheaper, and you're doing it at sorcery speed, so you're really just trading 1 for 1. And that's not amazing. The thing about Dire Downdraft is that it has this interaction at instant speed. So you can blow out somebody trying to cast Scales of Shale, for example, which there's lots of good tricks in this format, and a lot of them are pretty reactive. But Dire Downdraft is one that works against Scales of Shale, a removal spell. Most don't. And if you can set up a block and make your opponent cast Overprotect or something too, using this in response is great. Just being able to interact at instant speed is a huge deal. There's also a few fight and bite cards in this format that it punishes, and that's great. And the other thing is, just like Banishing Light, Dire Downdraft trades 1 for 1. You know, people see a card that bounces a card to their opponent's library, and they think, well, I didn't deal with their bomb because it's going to come back. And that's true, but you still do make your opponent draw that card and cast that card again. So it's a full 1 for 1 trade, and there are definitely situations where you force your opponent to put the card on the bottom because they really need to draw removal to answer your threats, and getting a creature right now isn't going to help them. So it trades 1 for 1, just like all good removal does, like at a minimum. And then it has this upside where you get 2 for 1 sometimes because it's an instant. So, Dire Downdraft ends up being a quality common, one that is being taken almost at a 9th pick, despite being significantly better than something like Banishing Light. Let's look now at Ruthless Negotiation. So this is one that maybe surprises me the most of the ones that are on here, at least going into the format. It has a win rate of 58%, which is a really good win rate. Like, that's like a high quality uncommon, and it's being taken around pick 8. So it's way better than Sticky Tongue Sentinel, for reference. So what's going on here? This is a format that's fast, right? You can't really afford to be relying on a card that gives you a long game 2 for 1, can you? Well, even gives you a 3 for 1 sometimes, because you make your opponent discard up front, and then later you can flash it back, and if they have a card, they discard, and you draw a card. So it can be a 3 for 1, and that's part of what makes this acceptable, or better than acceptable in this format, is that the ceiling on this is really high if you can get to that point. Additionally, disruption is better than usual in this format, and it's because of those freaking tricks again, which are miserable to play against, as you probably know in this format by now. If your opponent is attacking you and they have mana up, blocking is near impossible in this format, and that's not really where you want to be. So what do? What's the best way to deal with these tricks? It's to either get rid of them or at least make your opponent cast them when they're not advantageous. And Ruthless Negotiation is really good against people who are holding on to a trick, which is everyone in this format, more or less. So that's part of what makes Disruption better in general in this format, especially cheap Disruption that does more than just the basic discard effect. I mean, Psychic Whirl, for example, is still pretty bad. The Bandit class is, a solid build around. But Ruthless Negotiation is good in just any black deck in the format. It's at its best, obviously enough, I think, in black-green, which is the best or the second best color pair in the format overall. This is both because you are more likely to make the game go long with all your food and get the full 3-for-1, and because if you mill it, you can still get value out of it out of the graveyard beyond just foraging it away, which is also a thing you can do. So the card is kind of slow, but if you play this on 1, you put your opponent down a card and you're down a card too, and then later you can get more value out of it. And it just has this really, really high ceiling that it's not that hard to access, and the fail case is still an okay card. So, Ruthless Negotiation is a big overperformer in the format, and one of the better black uncommons, one of the better uncommons, period, in this whole set. Let's look at Daring Wave Rider now. So I think this is another example of how blue is being really heavily undervalued, and I think it should be to some degree. Like I keep saying in this video, it is the color you kind of least want to be in, but there are some uncommons that are strong enough that they should be pulling you in a little bit harder than they are, and Daring Wave Rider is definitely one of them. It has a win rate of 57.1%, and it's being picked around pick 7.1. And again, a 57.1% win rate for a blue card is more impressive than it is on like a white or a green or even a black card. Because, again, the blue commons are as bad as they are. You've got Light Shell Duo and Dire Downdraft, and everything else is kind of not where you want to be. But the Wave Rider is a good reason to, if you picked up, especially if you picked up like a blue rare mythic that's pretty good, and then pick 4 or 5, you see a Daring Wave Rider, you should be grabbing it because it works a lot like Wix Patrol, which I mentioned earlier. It's a 6-mana creature with a pretty sizable body, and it casts a removal spell. That's basically what it does. By the time you play it, it's casting removal. Sometimes it's casting like a card draw spell, but I'll take that too. No matter what, you get a 2-for-1. Sometimes you can get more than that, and that makes the Wave Rider really good. I mean, it's the exact kind of card that blue probably needed more of in this format, because blue it doesn't work that well as an aggro color. I mean, even the blue-white deck in this format of these like more aggressive decks really struggles, and the blue-green deck isn't really aggressive either, and usually it's not the blue cards that are helping you get there. So blue really needed more cards that help you get ahead from behind, and Daring Wave Rider does exactly that. Any card that adds a body to the board and kills something of your opponent's, which is what it effectively does the job. I mean, that really can pull you back ahead, even from behind, and certainly to parity. And this is a really strong uncommon that should make you consider jumping into blue a little more often than it apparently is at this point, because right now it's being taken around the same time as Sticky Tongue Sentinel, despite being substantially better. And again, it's got like a 1.4% higher win rate, but given that it's a blue card, that's even more impressive than it sounds. All right, and the last card I want to look at is Glide Dive Duo. So this has a win rate of 56.9%, and it's being taken around pick 7.3. So this is a really nice card in like all the black decks, and I think that's part of what makes it as good as it is. Like, this format has a bunch of cards that are effectively multicolored cards. I've mentioned Scales of Shale like 100 times in this video, and that's one of those. Like, it has a really high win rate, and it's being taken kind of late, but it's also a card that really only works if you've got like 5-ish lizards or more, and hopefully you have more than that. This is because paying the full 3 for Scales of Shale isn't very good, and even paying 2 isn't like incredible, it's acceptable. It's when you pay 1 that the card is nuts, and so people are only playing it in those really good decks, and that's why it has a win rate, because people are only playing it when it actually is cheap most of the time. But a card like Glide Dive Duo is just good in every black deck, and I like taking this kind of card in this format a little bit more than I like taking Scales of Shale, certainly in pack 1. You know, it's never going to have the ceiling Scales of Shale has, which is one of the best cards in your deck if you're a black-red deck. But it's always going to be an above-average card in your black deck, and that's because just playing a 5-mana 3/3 flyer that drains 2 life is a quality play. Like, it doesn't seem exciting, but drain 2 life is huge. I mean, it makes the gap between your life and your opponent's 4, right? From whatever it was, now there is a total difference of 4 between your life total and your opponent's, and that difference is in your advantage, to your advantage. That drastically alters races, especially when you're adding this body to the board that can also just threaten to attack on the next turn. You know, the black-green deck likes it because it usually sort of walks a bit of a tightrope early where it's taking hits and trading, and the goal is to sort of maybe get down to 7 or 5 life and then start gaining life with all of your food and your other effects most of the time. And once you start on that path, your opponent usually can't beat you in this format. And this is a card that helps you do it while adding to the board because, you know, it drains some life. Even the black-red deck, which is more aggressive, doesn't hate having this at the top of the curve because it can help close out the game, and it can also trigger all of your, if your opponent lost life this turn, stuff. But blue-black really likes it too. It's generally a slower deck that needs this kind of effect to stay in the game. And obviously black-white likes it because it likes gaining life. Even though I think most good black-white decks are sort of good stuff black-white decks with maybe a tiny bit of life gain payoff, but this obviously checks that box. So, you know, it's just a really nice comment. Now, it is true you don't want too many 5-drops in your deck, but having a couple of these at the top of your curve feels pretty good in most of the black decks in the format, and I think it should be getting valued a little bit higher. All right, so those are some cards in the format that I think are currently being undervalued. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including draft videos of this format, more analysis of this format, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.